Awesome. Oh, so excited to be here at the inaugural Framework Summit. Such a great idea for us to kind of come together as different platforms. So what I want to talk about is the React ecosystem today. So if you're new to React or just getting into it, you may hear that, on top of learning React, you have to learn Redux, you have to learn CSS and JS, you got to learn server-side rendering, like all these different things all at the same time in order to build a React application. And it can be really overwhelming. And like Andrew mentioned yesterday, React is just a UI library. So you have to make decisions on how you're going to fetch data, how are you going to manage state, and all these other things. And like, how can you pick something if you don't even know what the options are? And how can you make the right decision if you haven't even used it before? So what I want to do is kind of talk about the planets that surround React in the React solar system, so you can get an idea of like what to prioritize in terms of learning. So I'll kind of go in an order that I've kind of laid out. And then also I'll be giving options for each category in the options, and then kind of pick which one I think is the best. It's kind of my opinion, my preference. So, but to get started, first thing I want to do is I want to get everyone to stand up. I get everyone to stand up. Yeah, I know. Let's stand up. So it's the end of the conference. We're all kind of tired. We just had a break. So what I like to do in my talks is I like to not only kind of feed or exercise your mind, I also like to exercise our bodies. So we're going to do 10 squats like this all together in unison, okay? And since, it's a framework summit, it's JavaScript, we'll start 0. So it'll be 0-based counting, okay? So we'll do 10 of them together and I'll count it out, okay? And if you don't want to do it, you don't have to. You can just do your arms, but something fun for us to do together, okay? So let's do it. Ready? 0, yep. 1, okay. 2, yeah, a lot of energy. Okay, 3, nicely done. 4, keep it going. 5, let's have some good form. 6, almost there. 7, 8, and 9. Nicely done, everyone. Nicely done. Okay, so now we got the blood flowing. We got the energy there. Okay, so to formally introduce myself, my name is Ben Ilegbodu. As he said, I'm a Christian, a husband, and a father. It's a picture of my family. My wife, Rashida, we've been married 8 years now. We have 2 daughters, Simone, who is 4.5, and Avery, who just turned 2. And actually, my wife, Rashida, she's pregnant right now. And so we're expecting our 3rd child. And we actually, thank you. Thank you. Excited about that. We actually had a gender reveal party on Saturday to find out whether we're having a girl or whether we're having a boy. And we found out that we're having a boy. So our first boy, I'm excited about that. My daughter is super excited because she wanted to have a baby brother. She already has a baby sister, so why should she need another one? So lots of fun. I am a principal front-end engineer at Eventbrite. So in San Francisco, Eventbrite is an online ticketing and events platform. Unfortunately, this conference is not using Eventbrite. They're actually using one of our competitors, but that's quite okay. We actually just IPO 2 weeks ago, so I think we're doing okay. So we're excited about that. I work on our front-end platform, and that comprises the infrastructure side of things, tooling, which I'll talk about a little bit, as well as our React design system. So we used to be in Backbone 2.5 years ago, and we switched to React, and we haven't looked back since. So enough about me. Let's jump into this React ecosystem. And like I said, there's going to be lots of stuff to cover. So I've actually tweeted out a link to the slides already. So I'm going to have lots of links here and there. So if you want to follow those links, you have that already for you to check out. And like I said, I'll be giving my preferences on what we're talking about. So first, of course, stage 0, I guess I'll call it, is React. So in React, it's component-based, as we learned yesterday with Kent and Divya and Isaac's talk. And it's really important to know React really well. Like, it seems kind of obvious, but the first step is just like learn React, learn it really well. So learning some of those advanced component designs that they talked about yesterday. It's unidirectional, which is kind of different than traditional MVC frameworks. So wrapping your head around like how you update things indirectly, as well as the JSX that's there. So instead of having a separate template where you define your markup, the template is right there in the file, and people have differences of opinions on that. I really, really like it. Others don't, but that's something that you're gonna have to wrap your head around. And then there's a thing called the virtual DOM or the reconciler, which is the proper name. So instead of, if you want to make a change to the DOM, you don't change it directly, you update some state, which then changes it. But the nice thing is that it has a narrow API, which I like. So there's not too much to kind of keep in your head. There's still a lot to learn, but there's not too many APIs that you have to know. So the React docs have a great tutorial. You get to build a game and kind of learn the key parts about React. And I also, myself, I created a step-by-step workshop where I teach different concepts. It's called the React Fundamentals Workshop. So it's something that you can follow along by yourself. I also facilitate it, but you can follow along as well. So now let's jump into the first planet. It's Mercury. The first thing you kind of have to know when you're getting into React development, and that's tooling. And one of the more challenging things I would say in the history of React, because there's a lot of parts to it. So first, let me point out the React Dev Tools. So it's available for Chrome, it's available for Firefox as extensions, which allows you to inspect your React component tree. We just saw something similar with Vue, which was pretty awesome. So you can look at your props, you can look at your state. Now with the recent release of React 16.5, you can also inspect the performance of your app. So you get flame charts about which component's taking too long to render. It's a pretty cool tool to use. So then you got to think about what bundlers are you going to use? Are you going to use Webpack or Rollup or Parcel or Prepack that Facebook has come out with? Don't use Require.js. We used to use it in the beginning. It's a nightmare. Don't use that. You got to figure out what task runners you're going to use. Are you going to use Grunt? Are you going to use Gulp? Are you just going to use NPM scripts? And then you got to figure out, how are you going to do static analysis? Are you going to use ESLint? Are you going to use Flow for typing or TypeScript for typing? What are you going to do? And there's like so many decisions that you have to make up front just to try to build a React app that the React team came up with Create React App to make things a lot simpler for you. So in these 3 lines, you can get started with getting your React app bootstrapped so that you can focus on actually building the components. So you use Create React App, you give it the name, and then you start it up. And it comes equipped with, it works with either NPM or Yarn. You got Babel in there, latest version of Webpack, latest version of ESLint, testing, like all sorts of things in there, which makes it a lot easier to develop. So have a whole lot of other resources in there for you. There's this cool app that you can run locally called Guppy that kind of sits on top of Create React App. So it's a GUI on top of it if you don't want to run the command line. That's also something pretty cool to take a look at. So then there's styling. So not only is interaction important with React, is also styling. And I can think of maybe 5 different ways that you can style in React. And since React, again, is just the UI layer, you have to make that decision on what to do. So that's the next thing I think you should focus on, is styling. So likely if you're switching from React, you probably have some other separate system that does your CSS, that's bundling your CSS all together and gives you one big bundle. So maybe you're using Bootstrap or Foundation or some other system. So you have global CSS, so you just refer to the CSS classes in your code using the class name that's there. And then the generated CSS may look something like this, and you just have to make sure that, of course, you have no namespace collisions. So you could use something like BIM or SMAX or those kind of systems to make sure that your classes do not collide. So then you could take it a step further into what I call component CSS. So basically you just import a CSS snippet, basically. And You're not using it in the JavaScript file, but what it does is it associates the CSS with your JavaScript module so that you're not including any CSS that your application's not using, which would be the result of the global CSS one. So you import it there and then you reference the classes the same way. So hopefully if you already had some CSS system, it was already modular, so you may just be able to import that CSS file already and not have to do too much work. And then the result is that this is what your file will look like. You still have to properly namespace it, of course, because in the end, all of the CSS files will get concatenated together. So you still have to make sure you're not going to have namespace collisions, but you can only have to focus on the one file. So then the next step kind of past that is CSS modules with React. So in this case, you import the CSS module and it actually gives you a reference. And that's an object of names to auto-generated CSS classes. So in the end, you do css.root for the class name or css.title for a class name, and it's going to give you an automated generated class. Because what you write in your code, in your CSS now, is just the names of the classes. You don't have to worry about namespacing anything because CSS modules will do that for you. It'll end up generating a file that looks something like this for your CSS, and the corresponding classes will be inside of the markup. So you no longer have to worry about scoping or namespace collisions that way. So then people are like, you know what? Screw CSS. I'm tired of CSS. I'm tired of specificity wars. I'm tired of accidental cascading of CSS. And sometimes you have dynamic CSS that you have to inline style anyway. So why don't I just go all the way and make everything inline styles? And that way you import an object and then you assign everything to the style attribute instead of the class name attribute. And it allows for complete flexibility. Everything is controlled inside of the JavaScript. And what you end up importing is an object that looks something like this, just a plain old JavaScript object. And now the names of the properties, instead of being kebab case or hyphen case, are now camel case to match what the JavaScript DOM does for styles. And those are the properties, and you assign those. But the problem with inline styles in React is the problem with inline styles in general, and that they don't fully express all that you can do in CSS. So you can't do CSS animations. You can't do pseudo selectors. You can't do media queries. All of those sort of things are not possible with inline styles. So people came up with the concept of CSS and JS, the kind of best of both worlds of writing CSS, but also having your styling happening in JavaScript. And there are a number of options here. There's emotion, there's styled components, and several others there. If you're getting started, like I said, you would most likely start with one of the CSS solutions, not jump all the way to CSS and JS. But if you've already used a CSS and JS solution like emotion, which would be my preference, then you can start building your new apps with it. So I haven't really used any of these in great detail, but I've read the docs and looked at the APIs and talked to other folks about them. And emotion just has kind of it's the last one that was created. So it kind of took a lot of the best parts of the other ones and tried to avoid some of the negative parts of them in its solution. So my next project, I'll definitely be working on emotion. At Eventbrite, we actually used the component CSS one, the second option that I showed you. So here are some options for styling resources, as well as some component libraries like Material UI or React Foundation or React Bootstrap that you can take a look at. So now, the third one, the third step in it, Planet Earth, we talk about single page apps and the needs for single page apps. So the first one is you're likely going to need to be able to retrieve some data, right, to make HTTP calls, fetch calls. So unlike your batteries included framework like Angular, React doesn't have a system for that. So you have to figure out how you're going to actually make HTTP calls. But now all of our modern browsers have window.fetch, the fetch API that's promise-based that we can use. So instead of even using a library, we can just use what's natively in the browser. So it's just window.fetch, and you say the URL that you want, and then you get back a promise, and you can get the data that way. Most of the libraries, like Axios and all those other ones, are similar, but I just prefer to use the native one. And for the browsers that don't support it, there's a polyfill, and I have a link to it at the end for that. And there's the link to the polyfill there. I also have in my workshop a whole section about fetch and how to use it. The other part that you want to focus on when you're building a single page app is routing. Like, how do you keep your UI in sync with the URL? And there are two main options here. React Router is the obvious big one. It's been around since basically the beginning, and a lot of tools have been built around React Router. But recently, one of the authors of React Router created a new one called Reach Router, which is a accessibility first router, so that whenever you switch routes, it automatically puts focus on the part of the page that changed, so that you have that accessibility benefit to it. So they're both in active development. They're both seem really good. I like the API of Reach Router, so I will most likely use that one next. But at Eventbrite, we're heavily invested inside of React Router, and that's likely what you're going to see whenever you see other apps there. Okay, next one. The next stage after figuring out single page apps is everybody's favorite, forms. So forms are hard, like in general, right? And it's because form validation is hard. And unfortunately in React, it's no different. And the reason forms are hard is because there's all these different requirements for what your form should do. Like, should you show form errors, validation errors at the top together? Should you show it in line with each form element? Should it be synchronous validation, like regular expressions, or should it be API calls that you make, so asynchronous validation? Should the errors show when you leave a field? Should the errors show when you submit the form? Like, there's all kinds of different things that you have to do with form validation. And unfortunately, the React docs don't get into anything about validation. They talk about how to maintain state with forms, but none of the advanced topics. So there are a number of form libraries out there that you can use with React. Redux form is the main one, the most popular one, the one that's been around for the longest. But the main problem with Redux form is that it required Redux. And if you look at it yet, I haven't mentioned Redux as the thing to learn yet. So what would happen is that people who wanted to have form validation would then have to add in Redux when their app really didn't need Redux, and then they're using Redux wrong, and then Redux form, and it's like a whole host of problems. So the other two, Final Form and Formic, were a response to that. So Final Form was actually made by the same person who made Redux form to try to extract Redux from it. So it has a similar API. And then Formic was just another response, kind of built at the same time as Final Form. So we use Redux form heavily at Eventbrite. All of our apps, most of them use Redux at this point because they're pretty big. But it would be worth, I think, with one of our apps, we're going to try using Final Form because in some cases we don't need Redux, even though we've kind of gotten used to using it. So for our next one, we'll probably use Final Form. And that's what I would suggest using too, not having to bring in Redux there. And there's some resources there. So now we've hit the asteroid belt, right? So at this point, in my opinion, we have everything we need to be able to make a production quality app. Like the create React app for us, the tooling can actually create a production build for us that we can ship to production with all the different ways that we learned earlier today around deploying. So we've learned about React, we've learned about tooling, we've learned about styling, about how to create a single page app. And the single page app has routing, which has multiple pages, but it's called a single page app. But anyway, it's still a single page app. And we learned about forms, right? So now like everything past this point is like bigger apps, like large scale apps. So more things to consider. And the first thing I want to start with, Planet Jupyter, is testing. So I'm kind of sad that testing is this far because testing is really near and dear to my heart. Testing is really important to be able to have confidence in what we're building and to be able to refactor things and not have to cross your fingers that things work. But I believe that everything in front of it was more important. So with testing, there are a number of testing stacks, just like there are lots of frameworks. There are a lot of testing frameworks. So you can go kind of modular with Mocha and Chai. Chai, for instance, is just an assertion library. You could go with a full-fledged framework like Jest, which is what I suggest. It goes really well with React, and it's built by Facebook, so there's a lot of synergy there, and it has a lot of functionality. Jest is kind of moving towards being a whole platform, not necessarily just around testing. And then Ava was something that was really popular. It didn't really catch on in React as far as I know. Maybe in some other JavaScript areas it's caught on. But my suggestion would be in Jest. And kind of I wanted to show a quick example of how you can write a test because I don't know, I came from writing Backbone, writing jQuery. It was like impossible to write unit tests without having to spin up a whole browser, or at least a headless browser. But now we can write tests with user interactions without a browser. And this is using Enzyme as a library. So instead of rendering to the DOM, it renders it kind of in memory using Enzyme. So here we kind of mount the component, then we find the button that we want to click on, and then we simulate a click using Enzyme, not actual real click. And then we want to make sure that the CSS class active was on the button. And we can do all of that really quickly with the unit test. So the fact that React is testable in this way is just one of a huge selling points in my opinion, especially that simulation part of it. So Enzyme is this library. It's kind of has a jQuery-like interface. It has all these methods, all these utility belt methods that you can use for inspecting elements or interacting with React elements. So it's pretty cool. I also want to call out the third one on this list, React Testing Library. It was written by Kent C. Dodds, who talked yesterday. So the idea behind it is that Enzyme gives you so many utilities, some of which you really shouldn't be using in a unit test environment. You're really testing the details of a component. So React Testing Library is basically stripping out all of the stuff in Enzyme and only using the methods that you really should be calling when you're writing tests. So it doesn't use Enzyme at all. It's this whole completely separate thing, but it's basically solves all the things that I'm trying to tell people in code reviews not to use Enzyme for. So it solves that problem. So then up next, after testing, we finally are getting into app data management now. So up until this point, we've been implicitly using React's state management to manage all of our state. We would probably just be managing at the top level components. So, but once your app gets too complex and you have situations that Hassan was showing with Vue, where you have components wanting to talk to each other, or just many different components wanting to update the state, you might want to move into a global state management system. And the way that's normally done with React is with the Flux implementation. The two main ones with React are Redux and MobX. Redux probably being the more popular one, React Redux, so to speak. So Redux actually has been getting a lot of backlash these days. And I think it's because people are using it before they actually need to use it. So they're adding it into their app, they're using it incorrectly, or there's all this boilerplate that's around it when they don't really need the benefits that it's giving you. similar to what Hassan was saying with Vue and Vuex or Vuex, or what I used to call it, Vuex. So I think it's important to learn Redux when you actually need it, when you actually bump up to the issues that you're seeing with managing your data. So the main difference between Redux and MobX is that Redux takes the reducer approach, where you basically, whenever you want to mutate the state, you make a copy of it first, mutate that copy, and then you return the copy. So you never actually mutate objects. You're always making copies and then returning the copy. Whereas MobX uses observables, and you can mutate the state directly. The observable hears that stuff has changed, and then that gets reflected. So those are basically the two main differences between the two. I prefer Redux because it's similar to how React works in general in terms of immutability. You never mutate things, but either one works fine. But you'll probably see Redux more often. And on the topic of immutability, you may get to a point where if you go the Redux route, especially, you're doing a lot of defensive copying. So you're always copying arrays to add things to them, to remove things, to modify it. Same with objects. So if you have huge arrays or you have huge objects, you may need to use a mutability helper. So there's immutable, there's seamless immutable, and there's Ember. I just recently heard about Ember. It takes a different approach than the other two. The other ones are completely different APIs, different objects, but Ember just gives kind of this function, and then you say what you want to mutate, and then you pass in a callback function that says, it has the instructions, the mutations that you want to make, and then it returns you a new object. So you're always dealing with JavaScript objects. You never have to deal with any special objects. So I would like to actually try out that one next. Okay, and then the last, second to last one is performance and SEO. So if your app is getting big, more than likely you're going to need to have SEO concerns, and the best way to solve that is with server-side rendering. And there are a couple of options there. So there's Next.js, there's Gatsby, there's Razzle's, a whole lot of different ones. Next is a full-fledged framework that does basically everything for you, routing, code splitting, etc. Gatsby's more for static site generating and such, but I would definitely try Next. At Eventbrite, actually, our backend is not in Node. It's actually in Django. So we have to do this kind of special setup where we have a kind of side node thing that renders just React components, and Django talks to it. I have a video that goes into more details about that. Okay, and then the last one I want to talk about, the last planet, the one that's furthest away, is API optimization, because you will run into situations where in order to get data to render an app, you have to make 3 separate REST calls, which can be non-performant. So Netflix and Facebook came up with these ideas at the same time. Netflix came up with Falcor. Facebook came up with GraphQL. Looks like GraphQL has won. I don't even know if Netflix maintains Falcor that much anymore. And the biggest library with GraphQL is Apollo. But one thing to note with Apollo is that it has a tendency to take over your app and take over all the data management of your app, which could be a good thing if you're starting off with Apollo, because then you probably don't need Redux. But if you already have a whole Redux layer and then you're adding an Apollo, they could be fighting for data management there. So, quick recap, in case you maybe fell asleep while I was talking, or you had to take a drink of water after all the squats, is here. So, obviously start with React with your development. Tooling, use Create React App. Styling, use Emotion for it. Start off with CSS probably, but then maybe use Emotion. 3 for single page apps, React Router is great, plus the Fetch API. For forms, Final Form, try that out. Testing, Jest plus Enzyme, or Jest plus React testing library. Use Redux for state management. and then next for server-side rendering. And if you get to the point where you want to add Apollo or add GraphQL, use Apollo there. Okay, so that's it. I know I flooded you with a whole bunch of data and a whole bunch of information in a small amount of time. Like I said, the slides are available. You can go to my Twitter account, tweeted it there, or go to my website, benmvp.com for you. Hopefully you learned one or two things here. Even if you've used React before, maybe there's a library that you might want to check out. So to close, I just wanted to thank the conference for inviting me here to speak and kind of share my knowledge with you, and also just the whole concept of this conference is really, really cool. So I appreciate that. And then also thanks to all of you as well for attending the conference, because the conference wouldn't have worked if you didn't attend. So thank you for that. And, I go through the stress of preparing a talk and then delivering a talk in front of people. And I do it because I like to teach and I like to see people learn and grow from what they've known, or what I've been able to teach. So even if you got like one little thing out of it, one little nugget, all of that stress and all that preparation is totally worth it. So thank you all very, very much.